Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stacia Stelk, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Deep Roots Native Gardening webinar series. This is our last webinar for the season, but you can still watch the ones you might have missed. To access them, visit our website and click on webinars in the drop-down menu under events. Deep Roots is pleased to announce that we are taking our native plant landscaping conference to an online platform. Scheduled for 3 half days in September, Planet Native will host regional and national native plant experts. The virtual conference features an exhibit hall, roundtable discussions, and office hours with our speakers. Before we get started, don't forget to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A tool and make comments with its chat feature. At the end of today's presentation, we will take a few minutes to answer some of the most popular questions. This afternoon, we are welcoming Linda Lehrbaum, Project Manager for KC Wildlands, to join us in talking about managing invasive species in large tracts of land. Linda is an avid naturalist with a particular passion for terrestrial natural communities. She has been a program manager for the Kansas City Wildlands since its start with Virginia Gap in 2002. She developed the first bioblitzes in the Midwest, leading thousands of volunteers in hands-on habitat restoration. She coordinated Wildlands partner organizations and land managers in the conservation and restoration of the region's public remnant spaces. Please join me in welcoming Linda to our virtual stage.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. As Stacia said, I am the program manager for Kansas City Wildlands, and as such, we basically work on a lot of natural communities located on public lands on both sides of state line. But they're larger. They're not full expansive prairies, but Jerry Smith Prairie is 80 acres, Og's 11. They're pretty good, significant chunks of land. The Kansas City region, if any of you are landowners, you probably have some or a mix of these different kinds of ecosystems and habitats. The prairie we all know and love with its bountiful flowers, grasses, pretty treeless most of the time. The glades and the savannas are more open canopied, but still have a lot of oak hickory around here, and our bait and has a lot of prairie type plants. And then there's the forests and the woodlands, which have a more closed canopy, but still usually have a very lush floor of different kinds of native plants. And all of these share incredible diversity. It'll be different diversity for different habitat types, but the diversity of flowers, of grasses, then attract the diversity of the bees and the insects, the birds, and all of the different animals and microbes and fungi that call those habitats home. So when we stop and we look around in some of these habitats, in Kansas City, in the urban area, in the suburban area, and even in the rural area, we are dealing with attacks of alien invasive plants. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. There's a lot of different kinds of invasives, but our focus are going to be on some of the plant invasives, alien invasives, exotic invasives is another term that we're dealing with here in the Kansas City region. Now these are really significant. We call them exotic invasives here. Over a quarter of Missouri's plant species are exotic. That means they came from another part of the world and they were brought over for landscape or forage. That's a lot. That's a lot of different plants, but not all of these exotics are bad. Roses, of course, are good. We've got exotics that have gotten loose in the wildlands that aren't necessarily bad because they're not invading. And we do have native invasives. We're not going to be talking about those today. They're dealt with differently, sometimes the same way, but they respond differently. I can certainly talk to you later if you are dealing with more of the native invasive plants like dogwoods or cedars. But we're going to be focusing on exotic invasives, which are non-native, again, to the system, our indigenous habitats that we have here. When they are introduced, they can cause extreme harm to a habitat, as I'm sure everybody here who is watching this knows. The reason is, of course, because they didn't adapt with any of the plants or animals that were here originally. They just sort of came in and bullied their way through. They don't have natural enemies. They they just can outcompete our natives really easily. They become a very serious problem when they invade our native ecosystems. That's purple loosestrife there. I'm sure you're either dealing with it or you've heard of it before. Right now, there's over, Stacia just sent this to me yesterday, there's over 6,500 alien species that have been moved into the US. Now, that's not just plants, that's animals too, and probably some other species of life. But collectively, they're causing more damage to the environment, the economy, and human health than all natural disasters combined. So the characteristics of these invasive exotic plants. Number one is they produce a lot of seed. In the case of some of the landscape exotics that we're dealing with, that was part of their draw. They produced abundant flowers and abundant berries, making them very, very beautiful, especially when they watched the birds snarf them up, bring in all those bird life. But the problem with that seed is that then it germinates, and it germinates prolifically. A lot of these invasive exotic plants release biochemicals into the ground. That's a term called allelopathic. Know it, embrace it, hate it. It can thwart the development of any other surrounding plant life, which is, of course, the native plants that were there. They tolerate a variety of habitat conditions. They grow and they reproduce very rapidly. They outcompete natives for space, for sun, and for water. And they lack natural enemies. A really good example is garlic mustard. I read an article, garlic mustard comes over from Europe, was brought over as a potting herb. I read that over in Europe, there are 69 different species of insects that eat garlic mustard. And here there's exactly none. So it has a good head start on our natives. Most of this, this talk, I'm just going to go over different types of natives that we're dealing with, or exotics that we're dealing with, that are seriously affecting the health of the habitats in the Kansas City region. We're going to go over their biology real briefly and how we attack it. I do want to let you know that there are lots of different ways to go after infestations. And especially if you're dealing with property that's got more than one infestation, there can be a lot of combined efforts. Bear in mind, if you're writing any of this down, to pay attention to the times of year that we go after things in different ways, because that is really, really important, that kind of scheduling. Some plants, like the myrrh honeysuckle, that can be attacked all year long, basically, but you attack it a different way each time you go after it. And you will find that there are people that have had success with alternative ways of going after some of these plants, and I'm all for that. By no means is this the one and only way to go about things. So the shrub honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, a myrrh honeysuckle, evil honeysuckle, honeysuckle from hell is another term. This is one that everybody knows. You've seen it. If you're in Kansas City, you've seen this plant. This plant becomes a wall wherever it's growing. It was actually planted on purpose, I believe, in the 60s as a landscape plant. It is the first thing to green up in the spring and the last thing to drop leaves in the fall. Where it grows, nothing else can grow. It overshadows plants that are under it. It is very allelopathic, and we just found out that most of that poison, that biochemical warfare is actually occurring in the berries. So when they drop to the ground, they're spreading this warfare. The birds snarf these berries. Unfortunately, the berries are not good for the birds. They do much better if they're eating native berries. This is kind of like eating junk food for them. But then those birds put it in a little fertilizer packet, take it to a forest, take it wherever they want to, and go ahead and plant it for us to battle later. So the red berries appear in the fall. It thrives in forest understories and then also in transitional zones. So where woodlands are opening more up into prairie land, it absolutely thrives there. It also, it's just I have actually not seen anything take a bite out of this, except for a beaver once, but they only bit off one branch and then they left it alone. So the way Wildlands controls this through the use of manual labor is we hand pull it when it's small in the spring, especially when the soil's kind of damp. But mostly we cut it off. We cut it off low and stump treat. We use a chemical called Tordon RTU, which means ready to use. It is a pretty potent chemical, so you want to be extremely careful with its use. If you use that, you can also use, some folks are experimenting with 20% solution of glyphosate, but no matter what you use, just be very careful when you apply the chemical and don't let it spill into the soil or use it when it's around rain. You can also spray the leaves with a 2% solution of glyphosate and a non-ionic surfactant, which could be dish soap if you need it to be. Surfactant just sort of helps it to stick to the leaves. Some folks use a combination of cutting down the big trees and then coming back and respraying the respouts. But I can guarantee you, if you do not use an herbicide with honeysuckle, it will come back with a vengeance and you'll have a worse problem than when you started taking it down. Never cut honeysuckle unless you're going to treat the stump or spray the leaves that reappear. We've also had luck basil treating it. This is when this is done in the winter using a chemical like Pathfinder 2 and just spraying around the bark. And then the tree will leaf out in the spring, but then be dead by summer. If you are working on public land or you're out in a rural area that allows prescribed burning, once your fuel load comes back, so once the shrub's gone and the understory is growing in again, you're getting grasses and flowers again, you can burn. And if you do back-to-back burns, that'll knock back any seedlings that are trying to come in. Stay vigilant on this puppy. This is a bad plant. Garlic mustard is another one. This is a lovely little flower. Most people that see it will see it in the spring. It's biannual, has rosettes one year, and then the next year it grows up to the plant we know and hate. You can eat it, but by the time you're done pulling it, you probably never want to smell garlic or eat mustard ever again. It was brought over as a potting herb. It went into disturbed forests and woodlands, and it will become a wall-to-wall, acre-to-acre carpet in no time flat. The best way to get rid of this is actually hand pull. When you see the flowers, they're real easy to spot, and you can just go and pull them and pull them and pull them. You'll have to do this year after year again, because the seed, it produces a ton of seed that, should go ahead and move on to that one. It produces a ton of seed that will stay in the soil for quite some time, like a decade or so. You can apply a foliar spray, especially if you're dealing with the rosettes. Once you learn to recognize the rosettes on the ground, you can spray those with a 2% glyphosate in the fall or the very early spring. Problem with any kind of spring spraying is that's when the natives are starting to emerge too. So be very careful with that. And we're still not sure about prescribed burning, but it sure can't hurt this plant. I mean, it won't help it to keep going. When you hand pull this, you have got to bag it. You have to landfill it. The seed will not die. Alan Branhagen of Pal Gardens told me a story about putting one of the plants immature into his freezer for a year, took it out, threw it on the driveway in the heat, and it still went to seed. So don't risk getting it into your compost. Sericea Lespedeza, not a nice plant. This one invades our prairies and our grasslands. This one is, it's a legume. It looks like a legume. It was brought over as a forage plant, and the livestock hated it. So they ate everything but it, and it took off. The seed can stay in the dirt for up to 20 years. It's pretty gnarly. It tolerates poor soils, and it can quickly expand from a few plants out to, again, back to back to back acres of nothing but Sericea Lespedeza. And again, because this also is an allelopathic plant, its biochemical warfare will totally thwart any of the natives that you might be trying to save. We spot treat it with Wildlands. If it's a huge infestation, I know Johnson County Park and Rec District was dealing with some huge infestations, and they actually use UTVs with chemical that they can just go and start spraying side to side. They don't have, in fields like that don't have a lot of natives left, that is probably a good course of action. In our prairies where we're trying to protect, and we're trying to keep this plant from taking over the prairie, but also trying to protect the prairie from bad use of chemical, we spot spray. That is time consuming, and again, it has to be done year after year after year until you start to slow down the seed bank. And unfortunately, this lovely little plant loves fire. So you can use, that can be used to your advantage by lighting up your prairie on fire if that's legal for you to do. And that'll help to stimulate the next round of seed to pop up, and then you go after it again. So you can trigger this plant to pop up faster so that you can try and get through the seed bank in under a couple of generations. But we use, with Wildlands, we're using a chemical called Pasture Guard. But you can also use Remedy. Both of these are good in grasslands. They kind of save our native grasses. Now they're still going to nail any wildflowers that you hit with them by accident, but the native grasses will be spared. There's also a good way to control that, well, not control it, but to continue to battle it using mowing. There can be more information on that. I'll give you some resources at the end so you can look at different ways that other land managers are going after some of this stuff. Winter creeper, the evil of the woods. This is also still being sold in nurseries. Go harass nurseries that you see that are still selling this stuff. This one was brought over from Asia and used as ground cover in landscaping. It tolerates everything. It climbs up rocks, it climbs up trees. Once it goes up a tree, it becomes reproductive. And the birds eat it and they plant it. Take a look at that. That is where my little mouse cursor is. Those are old winter creeper vines. That was, that's how we had to get rid of it off of this tree. And talk about reproducing, boy, once it went up that tree, this entire woodland, this is Shirling Sanctuary at the zoo. The ground was covered in winter creeper, except in our very, very, an area we've been working on a couple of times by hand pulling. But the rest of the sanctuary was covered on the ground with this stuff. And you could see where it was coming from with these big trees that had all these gigantic winter creeper vines going up them. It was dark. It was a scary place. We're still able to start to bring this site back. In our delicate areas, it was hand pulled. And I put the word constantly there. I mean constantly. You need to stay on it. Cut vines going up the trunks are cut and stump treated. We did use Tordon RTU, not knowing if that was going to have an ill effect on the tree. It did not. But again, you must be very careful with stump application. You can, something that we've just started doing and we're starting to see results is spraying glyphosate, about a 3 to 4% solution in September. Now, where winter creeper is doing the most damage are forests that have spring ephemerals. So by September, those spring ephemerals have gone back into the ground. So you're not going to injure those. You will be injuring anything else that is up and about and alive. So you need to be aware of that. Glyphosate goes pretty much inert once it's in the soil. But if it hits anything green, that green is going to pull it in and it's going to kill that plant. We don't know whether that works for another 18 months, but we've been doing it for enough years now that we're starting to see that it is successful. Again, stay vigilant, stay on top of this, have faith. Japanese honeysuckle, introduced from Japan, obviously. There are native honeysuckles, so take a look at that. The leaves near the tips of the vines are opposite and they're not united. The leaves on native honeysuckles are united at the base, forming sort of a single leaf that wraps around the stem. That's how you can tell if you have any questions. again, glyphosate solution is best, and do that before the hard freeze, but late in the fall if you can. And there could be some other ways that people are this is always a growing art, so to speak, on how to get rid of this stuff. Again, aerial vines, get rid of the aerial vines quickly. What is this one? Autumn olive. This is not one that we have been dealing with much on wildland sites, but Eastern Jackson County deals a ton with this. And we are starting to find it on some of our prairies, unfortunately. It loves lots of heat and it's very drought tolerant. So when it's small, again, you can remove it by hand if you've got the time and the energy. And I would say pretty much go after this the way that you go after honeysuckle, using glyphosate or Tordon, cutting low to the ground. Make sure you stump treat. Teasel, again, is not one that we deal with on the wildland sites yet, but it is one that is absolutely the enemy of any wild areas that are out in rural areas. So it can become a monoculture, like most of these invasive species can. This one, I understand, was brought over because they actually used the thistle part as something to raise the nap on wool and fabric. Fascinating. That was a dumb idea, but it was introduced from Europe. Sunny, wet, dry conditions. You'll see a ton of these in roadside ditches in the country. Again, its big problem is thousands and thousands of seeds, 30 to 80% germination rate. It's the same with all, it's sort of a running trend with all of these plants. Teasel, I know a lot of folks that do dig up the rosettes with dandelion diggers. It depends on the amount of time you have and the amount of patience. You can pull them. A lot of folks just go and cut the seed heads off of flowering plants, so at least that they don't get the seed bank to continue going. They might still have the teasel plant, but the seed is not going to be a threat for the next year. And also they can, the plant can be spot treated. I put down crossbow here, but I'm sure that there are other herbicides that you can use to spot treat. And you'll want to do that before, obviously, before they go to seed. Crown vetch, that's a brand new puppy that we're just discovering on one of our sites. So I'm kind of curious about this one. Crown vetch was used as roadside erosion control by a lot of dots in the US, brought in from North Africa. And it's very lovely. It's short and it is a monoculture once it gets going. So repeated late spring mowing can slow it down. From what I understand, I don't have experience with this plant yet, but I do understand glyphosate or triclopyr. And again, the triclopyr will be a little bit more sparing on any of the native grasses that you want there. I was a little disappointed to see that burning is only effective for detecting, because we're seeing it jump up on one of our burn units. And it's like, darn, I was hoping we could get rid of it with a burn, but that's not going to happen. This is one you should all know and love and hate. The old calorie pear, I refer to it as Spheros Pair. Just know that this is the next honeysuckle. Be really vigilant for this plant. There's a lot of beautiful white flowering plants in the spring that flower at the same time as this. But once you get used to identifying this, you'll never forget it. And the way I identify it, the fastest out in the field from a distance is that cone shape, that pear, neat, tidy cone shape, or something like wild plum is going to have a more open, rounded flowering canopy there. So do be on the lookout for this in your grasslands if you're managing grasslands at all. It's just like a feral pig. This thing comes back nasty with little thorns and little teeth, and it bites you when you walk by, and I'm pretty sure they flip you off when you pass them. They're pretty nasty. So controlling it, live infestation, you just do it by hand. I would imagine that this plant can come back with resprouts. I don't know that for sure. The only plant that I would ever cut and not stump treat would be a red cedar. Those don't come back. They don't resprout. Otherwise, I would play it safe unless you've read or heard directly from somebody else that you don't need to stump treat. You can also, again, foliar spray it in mid to late summer. But that would just be for small ones. Be careful with foliar spraying. You do a lot better cutting and stump treating, or if you don't have the capacity for that, cut them, let those cut plants resprout, and then go back after the resprouts at the appropriate time. And the reason for that is because that's a lot of chemical if you are foliar spraying a full-blown 30-foot tall tree. We don't want to go there. We want to be as judicious and thoughtful with the use of herbicide as possible. But do know that herbicide is a very important weapon in the full range arsenal of battling these exotic invasives. I'm going to try and wrap it up here. I'm sorry, I'm yammering on. Oh, good. So there are more. Dishonorable mention list. We're seeing more and more of all of these in our wildland sites, and therefore they're in the area. The Japanese hops, riparian areas, that'll swallow a riparian forest. If you've got a wooded or a riparian forest, it can come in along the rivers and just swallow the land banks next to it. Johnson grass, if you're dealing with prairie, that's one that you have got to get under control. Burning bush, we're seeing more and more of that inside of our more canopied forests. And multiflora rose just seems to be everywhere that you want to be, and tangles you up. It's mean. Sweet clover can be hand pulled, but if you don't stay on top of it, again, it can get out of control. And I'm sure that there are many more on the way. So survey what's growing on your property. Pay attention, survey everything. If you see a small infestation, it can take over your land if you decide to walk away from it. Know your battle schedule for every individual species. Timing is critical. We've got September sprays, winter cuts, spring attacks, and then especially if you're incorporating in mowing and cutting and some of the other things that I did not go into, there are very specific times that you would want to do that also. Patience, please, no patience. This is never going to be a one and done. This will be a lifelong commitment. Just like you got to brush your dog every couple of weeks and take them to the vet, you're going to have to manage and love on this land for as long as you and that land are together. Stay vigilant out there. So we hope to see you on the wildlands. Come on out and you'll see what volunteers and a lot of hard work have helped to bring back. Diversity, health, beauty, sanity, and you'll also see what we still have left to battle. And here's areas for more information. If you have questions of me, you're welcome to email me anytime. Missouri Department of Conservation has a really good searchable website for each specific kind of plant, as well as the Missouri Invasive Task Force. And then, of course, there's extension offices over in Kansas and probably a million more resources that I did not touch base with. I was just trying to keep it kind of local. So at that point, I'm done and ready to take any questions if you have any.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. First and foremost, I have a comment from Linda, from Julie, who says that MDC says to treat calorie pear and it needs to be stump treated to be killed off.
Okay,
So
perfect. I kind of figured.
Okay, very good.
Yes, that's a new one on our site, so I'm just starting to get to know it.
I understand. Yeah, and it's always fun when one of your neighbors has one and you're trying to figure out, can I take it out in the middle of the night? Will they notice that I took out their tree? No, I have not done that yet. So we had a question early on, and I think you answered it later, but let's just reiterate. Everett would like to know whether or not to spray leaves with 20% or 2% glyphosate.
For stump treatment, we're using 20% on up. For spraying leaves, it depends on the species. Like winter creeper has got a waxy coating that needs to stick to that leaf for a while. So we've been using 3 to 4%, but everything else I would stick, when push comes to shove, read the label. The label will tell you how to use it and what percentage to put it at. If I can't tell you if you think, oh, if 2% is good, 3% is going to fry this puppy, it will fry it. It'll stress it fast, it'll drop its leaves, you think success, and then the plant comes back laughing at you because the roots, you know, it just sloughed it off. So use the appropriate percentage according to the label.
Very good. Well, Val asks, is stump treating only effective in the fall?
No, stump treating can be done anytime. We've experimented with that for the past 20 years with honeysuckle. My favorite time to do it is in the fall and the winter when it's, you know, above 32 degrees. Fall is great because you can see the honeysuckle. It's real easy. It's the only thing that's green. Anything that's green is fair game come late October, early November. We've also, there was talk about it not working in the spring because the honeysuckle's sapping up, basically. My experiment showed that's not true. It will indeed kill the honeysuckle, but what I did find was honeysuckle, when you use Tordon RTU anyway, that can actually travel through wet soil and be taken up by some of our native trees, which is why it's critical that you use it very, very appropriately. The only time we've had collateral damage is using Tordon in a forested area in the early spring when the natives were sapping up also. So the honeysuckle did indeed die and stayed dead, but we also did some chemical damage to some of our native pawpaws where probably the honeysuckle roots were crossing over their roots. Now we didn't kill them, they stayed alive, but they were kind of sick for that season. So we generally don't apply at least Tordon RTU in the spring. We do have a master naturalist who's running experiments on different percentages of shrub honeysuckle stump treatment using glyphosate at different times of year, but I don't have all that information back yet.
Well, a couple of times you've referred to be careful, read the label. Are there best management practices for keeping yourself safe, for protecting plants that you don't want to hurt? Are there training opportunities out there, or is this sort of a new area?
Well, I don't think it's a new area, and everybody I talk to has got a different way that they like to go about it. Certainly safety equipment, you'll always want to have long pants, good boots, long sleeve shirt, and we use disposable nitrile gloves. You can use dish gloves, just make sure you've got good rubber, chemical resistant gloves. That's with spot treating using a bottle. If you're using a spray, you might want to have goggles on too. Know what the chemical is. You don't want to spray chemical when it's too hot out. One, it won't work as well. Two, you can get some off-gassing from the chemical on some of the chemicals where it actually evaporates into the air. Who knows what it's doing to you, but it's also killing trees that are nearby by just being vaporized in the air. So, but this information is all available on the labels of the bottles. If, like Tordon, you could go right now to Dow and pull up safety data before you even went and looked at the bottle. You can pull up the safety data and the information on Tordon. There's Remedy, Pasture Guard, Garland, then there's generic forms of all of the big chemicals. But yeah, ask around. If you're dealing with a specific issue, like I mentioned Johnson grass earlier, that takes an even different herbicide than one I've ever used before. We don't, our land managers actually take care of the Johnson grass infestations when we run across them. So I'm not even sure of the chemical there or the right time of year. I know if you try to spray Johnson grass when it's droughty, it won't take it up. So it's just a waste of chemical and a waste of time. Some chemical goes inert into the soil, some does not. Some can be, none of it should be sprayed or dropped onto a stump if there's rain in the forecast or snow on the ground. You just want to be, smart about it.
Makes sense. So Linda asked whether or not the Kansas City Park System, and this could be an interesting discussion because it's a lot, whether or not they try to eliminate the exotic plants, because she has seen several of these on trails. And I know KC Parks would love to get rid of every single one of these invasive species. So you want to touch on a little bit of an answer there?
Parks is doing what Wildlands does, which is triage work. And there is no way, 6,500 species in the US, there's no way we're going to get rid of all the exotics. There's absolutely no way. Even one species of exotic, like say shrub honeysuckle. But the Wildlands picks its most highly biological diverse part of its site, and we work out from there. And we go as far as we can go and still be able to manage taking care of that site. And if we can, we'll expand it even farther. For instance, Rocky Point Glade started out as a 20-acre restoration. We had success. We had extra volunteers and time, and we've been able to continue going out. And it's now a 50-acre restoration. Then we expanded and jumped across our buffer zone and started working on it there. But now we're having to go back and keep a more vigilant eye on our original restoration area. That whole area that it's located in is probably 2,000 acres. We will never be able to clear all of that. So even with your own property, I suggest doing triage work. What is the most important thing you're trying to save? Is it an area of high biological diversity? Is it a rock feature that you really love? Is it a creek? Start there, move out. If everybody that used a trail in Kansas City wanted to donate 8 hours a year in removing shrub honeysuckle, we could make one heck of a dent in what people see. We could have opened areas of woodlands again. We can, Johnson County was able to acquire some major funding to actually hire a consultation group to go, a contracting group to go in and remove acres and acres and acres of shrub honeysuckle all at once. This is like a dream come true, but they will still need to be vigilant on it forever because birds will be birds and will eat shrub honeysuckle berries from somewhere else and bring it back into this woodland, let alone the seed bank that's there. But once we start to get used to even on the parklands, once people start to get used to the aesthetic of not having shrub honeysuckle there and what a woodland actually looks like, or a prairie land or a glade really looks like, you take a deeper breath when you're not surrounded with walls of green or monocultures of something that just doesn't feel right. When you start to see that diversity, that beauty that was always there and just got trampled down by these exotic invasives, it becomes something that is part of your culture and something that you want, that you crave when you take a hike, when you go for a walk, when you look out your car window driving down a road that's wooded. It feels right, feels healthy.
Right. Well, I think a little bit about the invasive species, and I compare it to, well, coronavirus and measles and chickenpox. It's something that's going to be with us forever. How do we manage it? In an ideal world, we can eradicate it, but for now, let's just go after them and get them off our land, right?
And give it another 500 years, and some of our natives will start to adapt with those plants, and they might find a nice compromise and a nice balance. But meanwhile, I'd sure hate for my grandchildren to not ever know what a prairie looks like, just a big wall of green. Interspersed with Sericea Lespedeza. They need to know what these original landscapes look like, what they feel like.
Right. Well, and the species that rely on them, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. If you go into a woodland that is completely infested with shrub honeysuckle, you'll hear birds, but you're not going to see all of the insects, hear all of the different birds, see all of the different life that you do in a healthy, very highly diverse, natural ecosystem. Jerry Smith Prairie has 69 species of native bee on it, and Lord knows how many species of butterfly and dragonfly, and therefore the birds that thrive off of these. Where you go to a degraded area that is infested, and you might find 3 species of native bee, and that's it.
Right.
And once you see the difference, it becomes a calling for a lot of people. So if you want to get called, please come and work with Wildlands, and we'll show you how to kill bad plants, and then you can go and do your own.
Excellent. All right, I have one comment that I'm going to share and then one last question. And the comment, I think, points to what you just said. Paul says, humans need to become human plant grazers. If you see a honeysuckle, just pull a couple, and everyone pulled a couple, and we could just get rid of it.
Yep, yep.
Okay, so, all right, so Teresa asked, what do you know about the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force? And do you know if they're making any headway in getting the sale of some of these invasives banned?
I am embarrassed to say I do not know. This was born out of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, I believe, and then the Native Plants organization. Sorry, totally losing my mind here. But they are local, and they are. It's something that I actually want to look into because I'm kind of interested in joining the task force. But they're basically trying to educate folks. We're not the only ones, obviously, who are dealing with this quantity of invasive species, and the urban areas, especially urban areas that are trying to manage some native natural habitats and ecosystems, are dealing with the same things we are. St. Louis, Columbia. These guys go all over the state and are kind of getting everybody's ideas and best practices together, and then getting that information out there. And I think they're focusing on government, so parklands, et cetera, but I'm not positive about that. But do go. I'm going to go online and look them up and see what we can find out about that.
Very good. And well, and one of the things that with a lot of these invasive species, on a hike recently with Larry Brizzo and you and me, Larry said that he's called a lot of the local major nurseries and they've quit carrying these species, but there's still a lot farther we can go.
Yes, there are.
So with that, Linda, this was terrific. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Your energy and enthusiasm is contagious. And with leadership like yours, I think all of us will become plant grazers and pull a few whenever we see some.
That's a great term. I like that.
I do too. I think I'm going to stick with it.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. If you have any unanswered questions, especially when it comes to some of the chemical management specific questions that Linda was referring to, please feel free to email her at linda@bridgingthegap.org, or you can email us at hello@deeprootskc.org. We hope that you can find our website, deeprootskc.org, and that it'll be a great resource for you. We can help you find native plants, plan a garden, and much more. And if you like what you've seen on these webinars, please consider making a donation. With your support, we've been able to maintain this webinar series, and we're already working on a plan for January, so I hope you can join us again then. Finally, I hope you will consider joining us at Planet Native in September with regional and national experts, and maybe you can, so we'll have some social networking opportunities a lot more robust than you'll find in a webinar. And I'm sure Linda will be there, I will be there, and a lot of your friends, and you'll have the opportunity to pull people aside and have one-on-one conversations in a very safe and socially distant way. So for all of that, thank you for joining us. And again, thank you, Linda. It's been a terrific afternoon. Cheers, everyone, and please be safe.